Hello and welcome to our first Federalism and Missouri Constitution video. Today we are going to be talking about discussing the changing relationships between the states and the federal government. To get started, of course, we're going to talk about federalism because it's awesome. So, for your viewing pleasure. Federalism, what? Federalism, what? A division of what? Of power between the states and the federal government. Yeah. You're welcome. So yes, federalism is a system of government in which power is divided between the national government and between states and regional governments. So in the United States, we have a federal system. Now I say federalism and federal system, and I use those terms interchangeably because they're both really the same thing. So I want you to make sure that you know that those are the same term. All right, so moving on then to federalism and the Constitution. We're going to be looking at four main power breakdowns in the Constitution. We're going to be looking at the powers of the national government, things that they can do, things that they're supposed to do, powers of the state governments, powers that are prohibited, and powers that are shared by both of those governments. So starting off then with the powers of the national government. So if I were going to look somewhere to figure out where the powers of the national government are located, I would look in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. Now we've talked about this section before in our legislative branch unit a few weeks ago, but Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution specifically spells out the powers that Congress has, and we call those enumerated powers. Sometimes they're called expressed powers. Either way will work for us. The last of those expressed powers in the Constitution is called the Elastic Clause. Now take a second, think about what that's also called. Good. The Elastic Clause is also known as the Necessary and Proper Clause. And it's that last part, it's kind of like the disclaimer clause of Article 1, Section 8. That basically says Congress has the power to make any law that they think is necessary and proper, okay? So why do we call it the Elastic Clause? Because it greatly increases or it stretches the power of Congress. So some other powers that the national government has, they have inherent powers. And this is something that we kind of sort of touched on a little bit in our Congress unit, but we're going to look at it a little deeper here. So whenever you think of inherent powers, I want you to think of powers that somebody has to have in order to do anything. Okay, so let's take coffee, for example. Let's say that there's a sign in the library that says, coffee is available for teachers, okay? So in order for me as a teacher to have that coffee, what's something that I'll need? I'll probably need a cup, right? I'll need a cup to put the coffee in. Maybe I'll need some water, okay? I'll need the ability to go to the library and make the coffee or have someone do it for me. But those things would be inherent powers, okay? In addition to being able to drink coffee, I would have to have a cup, I'd have to have water, I'd have to have the coffee to put in there, okay? So all of those things that aren't necessarily spelled out in my ability to drink coffee would be inherent, okay? So some examples in the federal government. It doesn't say anything in the Constitution about the federal government's authority to acquire territory, okay? But it also doesn't say that they can't acquire territory. And Thomas Jefferson, whenever he bought the Louisiana Territory, said, well, the Constitution says I have the authority to govern territory. So the authority to govern territory implies that I have the ability to acquire it. So I'm going to go ahead and buy it, okay? And we have some other chunks of land in the United States that have been acquired using that same mentality. Also, an inherent power would be the power to draft. Okay, in the Constitution, it says that Congress has the authority to build up this military. But, in order to have a military, one of the things you've got to have is people. Okay, so that's how Congress has implemented the draft in years past. We also have the Supremacy Clause. That's another source of power for the national government. And the Supremacy Clause can be found in Article 6, Clause 2 of the Constitution, and it basically says the United States Constitution is the supreme law of the land, okay? So state governments can't make laws that are directly in conflict with the Constitution. And Maryland, the great state of Maryland, ran into that issue whenever James McCulloch, who was the branch manager of the Second Bank of the United States, said, no, state of Maryland, I'm not paying the tax. I'm not going to add that tax that the state government was adding to a federal institution, because you can't do that, because that violates the supremacy of national law. And with that, I will stop. We will pick up with more powers on our next video. Later.